So we're really glad to have Tim here in conversation with Allan. They did this class about a month ago. I think it was right after the insurrection. So it was timely to, you did it for the Unitarian Universalist Church, and it was very compelling. People were engaged, and as I watched it, I thought, oh, you need to bring this to Montview Church. So we're so glad you have. What we're going to do is have Allan speak about QAnon and conspiracy theories. Then Tim will also have comments. And then I'd like to have you two converse. Now that'll probably fill the hour. If we have time, we would, and questions that will be pertinent to the conversation to enhance it, that would be great. But we'll focus on you all right now. And thank you again for being here. And thank you all 89 of you plus for being with us today. So take it away.
Well, let me just say thank you very much for both that introduction and also just for the invitation. The timeliness of this is so funny, because there really was kind of an ebb in this before November, and then of course some very unexpected things happened, and here we are. So that being said, I feel like also just in the last few weeks, probably people are much more familiar with the Q and QAnon as a concept than they certainly had been. And there's even been some development since then. So I thought an interesting thing at this stage to do was to really focus on sort of the early side of how the Q world developed, and then also sort of the more recent stuff, because there really has been such a shift. And thinking back through all the material, some of the themes will, of course, sort of emerge, which I'm sure we'll be spending most of the rest of the time talking about. So just so we're all on the same page, and to kind of note what makes up this sort of Q worldview, is the belief that the world is now, and for perhaps a very long time, has been embroiled in a sort of secret struggle waged by the word cabal is almost always used, of sort of global elites, and this would be people like political figures like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, but also other notable famous progressive people, wealthy people, Bill Gates, others like that. And the idea is that these individuals have this sort of nefarious control over the world, maintaining a corrupt status quo, and at the most extreme levels, they are involved in both pedophilic and cannibalistic practices. And the idea is that there has always been, and now in the person of Donald Trump and those working with him, a sort of group of truth-fighting, righteous people who are trying to undo this. There is a good deal of diversity in this worldview. For example, there's a very diehard group of Q supporters who believe John F. Kennedy Jr. is part of this. And is sort of pulling the strings from backstage. Q as a figure, Q represents a kind of security clearance that happens in the global intelligence community, Q clearance, and was a sort of name of a sort listed on these web items that began to appear that described what was going on in this sort of global fight during the Trump administration. So these first began to appear on the how do you describe it? The internet. I think of it as like the internet Mos Eisley cantina of places called 4chan. Just the proverbial place where bad people kind of congregate. But it actually shifted to its own sort of website called 8chan, and these messages referred to as drops would come and sort of appear, and people would speculate on them, and this sort of motivated things going forward. The messages and things in that were described to be breadcrumbs, and so sort of the motif of sort of a secret understanding of where things were going. There are things to note sort of about this. In fact, one I had forgotten in our last discussion about this is that actually a big early Q example was the Covfefe moment, if anyone remembers this, where Trump probably, what really happened is that he stumbled or whatever with his thumbs and wrote a nonsense word, Covfefe, Covfefe, In the Q community, this became like an early secret speculative message that might have all this information. So this is sort of a community of people who are looking for information and sort of waiting for a story to unfold. Again, I think some of this is more familiar to people now, but another predecessor example or something sort of related to this, and perhaps the most public example of where there was real danger before the Capitol riot, was the Pizzagate conspiracy, where a man came into a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C. with an assault rifle because he was sure that what ended up being a broom closet was actually a secret layer full of the sort of stolen children. Interestingly, and kind of like bring it together now that we have seen the Capitol riot happen, worth noting that some of the most notable figures, now that we're seeing them in the news, are not only Q supporters, but like Q celebrities. So for example, the gentleman with the sort of Viking horns was a long time sort of Q activist, referred to as the Q, I think the Q prophet, or the Q, Q prophet. So some of these figures who we're seeing are not like tangential to the Capitol riot, but are real centerpieces to it. And another thing to note is that since that has happened, obviously Inauguration Day was a kind of 0 hour for this Q conspiracy. So we're currently in this moment of, I would say, panicked reinterpretation. People trying to figure out sort of what all is at stake in this. And one thing to note is that 8chan website where so much of this was happening has actually effectively closed up, and Q as a internet phenomenon has effectively gone silent. So we're in this kind of very uncertain period where what had been sort of the pattern for this all along. But as we'll talk about, I'm sure going forward, preparation in the community had sort of already taken root to come up with new ways of seeing this and sort of interpreting what was going on, both to either minimize what Trump's role was, or to maximize the possibilities of this being something larger than just the government piece. So we sort of had the story up until that Inauguration Day, and now we're in this kind of who knows what the future looks like. But I'll just stop there as like a real setup to just say this is kind of where we're at. So Tim, take it away.
Thank you, Allan. And thanks everybody for joining us for this conversation. Allan also teaches at Case Western Reserve University. I want to ask him how the class that just started last week is going, but that's on something completely different. At any rate, thanks, Allan, for giving us that overview of QAnon and the movement and all of that. We'll be covering some of the same ground. A few of you might have been on the session at the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Cleveland a few weeks ago, and I think our idea is to cover that again, but then to kind of continue the conversation from there and think of it as like, you know, each of us talking, then the two of us talking, then the two of us in Clover talking, and as time allows, keep widening that conversation. But in general, in terms of context for this, I just think it's really important that we are having these conversations in our faith communities, not just with regard to QAnon, which may be around for a long time or might not, but in terms of what we call new religious movements in general, NRMs. It's such a popular field of study in religious studies that it has its own acronym. And, you know, a lot of these NRMs have connections to white supremacy. A lot of them are white supremacist movements. A lot of them are militant and apocalyptic. We'll talk more about that too. But I think what's really important to remember and keep in mind here is that most of them have very clear Christian and even biblical roots to them. I spent some time studying white supremacist culture, militant white supremacist culture, like out in Hayden Lake and the Aryan Nations and groups like that. And it was amazing to me, remarkable to me, just how deeply rooted they were in Christianity and biblical interpretation of a particular kind. So what I want to emphasize is that these movements are really most often at core religious movements. We hear in the newspaper all the time that the phrase now is conspiracy theories. And there are people who are scholars of conspiracy theories and experts in conspiracy theories who are talking with us, but we can also think about them as religious movements. And I think if we ignore their religious dimensions of these kinds of movements, or play down the religious dimensions of these kinds of movements, we really can't understand them, and we miss a really important dimension of them. I think a lot of people in political science think that these religious dimensions are just kind of superficial. They're just sort of, a facade to help justify them. I think that's a wrong way to think about them. I think they are at core and fundamentally religious. And we've gone down this road before where we've misunderstood movements by not paying attention to them and taking them seriously as religion. Think about Jonestown, the Jonestown massacre in Guyana, Jim Jones, Heaven's Gate, that phenomenon, the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. These are all examples of us as a people really missing a lot and maybe leading to greater tragedy as a result of not understanding them as religion. So, and as religionists, Allan and I are religionists, and we like to think that all of you are too. We don't want to shy away from stuff that seems crazy or weird or violent or extreme, right? We don't dismiss those things. And I like this statement that comes from forgetting who, the Latin, Terence, I think, the Latin playwright. I am human, therefore nothing human is foreign to me. That is to say, that's really what we kind of stake our faith on as religionists. If it's human, we can understand it. And by understand, I mean, see how it makes sense for people, see how it is true for people, according to a certain narrative within a certain context. And I heard the host of a podcast that is studying the QAnon phenomenon. It's called QAnon Anonymous. Say that 5 times fast. Allan told me about it first. And the head of that said, any of us could be QAnon. Any of us could join QAnon. We need to get over thinking it's crazy people or it's foolish people or people who are easily fooled. We have to understand that we too, could find ourselves open to a movement like that. So just in general about these kinds of movements, 3 quick points that might be worth keeping in mind. First, these movements tend to be very systematic and very, I would describe them as intellectual, ideological. They are most often very, elaborate constellations of ideas that all integrate and work together and are systematic in that way, so that there's a lot to study and a lot to immerse oneself in and a long way to go in understanding. Stephen Lewandowski describes them as self-sealing. Like if you think about even fundamentalist Christianity is another example of this. It's a totalizing system that claims to make sense of everything and every little detail, and all of the little parts within it are connected to each other and relate to one another. So self-sealing and sealing one off from larger social contexts. So that's one thing about them. They're very ideological, intellectual, systematic. Second, they tend to be apocalyptic, and Allan already alluded to this, but the basic meaning of apocalypse is a revelation, apocalypte, out of covering or from covering, a revelation. But the revelation tends to be that what is happening now, might look bad or might not look bad, but in fact, the truth of it is that it is actually an ultimate struggle, a cosmic struggle, even between the cosmic forces of good and evil, or between God and Satan. And these, everyday enemies, Hillary Clinton or whoever, they're not just political opponents. They are actually agents with some kind of connection to supernatural evil. And so it looks like a normal political struggle, but in fact, it's this cosmic struggle between good and evil. And we are right in the middle of it. And we see it because it's being revealed to us, even though those outside of our community can't see it, right? So again, that creates that kind of us on the inside versus those on the outside who don't see it the way we do. The third thing is that these movements can be, and especially I think in this case, what I would call othering machines. They, you plug people into the system, and out they come as diabolical monsters rather than just as opponents. It's us versus them, us on the inside versus the other, and that other isn't just, again, an opponent, but is actually, monstrously evil. And so you get these ideas about child sex trafficking and orgies and blood drinking and all of that kind of stuff. At the core of a lot of that othering is anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. And we have to ask ourselves why so often anti-Semitism is at the root of so many of these movements. And that's definitely true in white supremacist movements as well. And that speaks to some of the not very flattering Christian roots in these movements. So that's a little bit in general, a very little bit then about QAnon in particular, and then we'll talk more about it. But one of the things that strikes me about it is this, what I would describe as generative incomprehensibility, that the Q drops, they're called drops, these posts, these statements are incredibly cryptic. They're not literally readable for the most part. Even when they are a grammatically readable sentence, they still, what is it talking about? They're cryptic, and as Allan said, they're seen as breadcrumbs, as kind of clues to follow. And for those on the inside of the movement, they're taken as, encoded messages. And the job of the Anons, of the QAnonymouses, the anonymous followers, is to decode them and to see what they are really revealing, back to that apocalypticism, about the world that we are in and what is happening or what is about to happen. There's this basic idea that Q sort of sees all of history. There's even theories that this Q travels in time, and things like this, to be able to have this kind of comprehensive understanding of all of history, past, present, and future. And so that generative incomprehensibility is part of what makes it interesting and exciting, makes the community an interpretive community, because they're working together to try to decipher and interpret. And it's generative in that, well, if it's a misinterpretation, if it turns out not to be what we thought it was, that encrypted message is still there with potential to be read in a different way and to sort of recalculate what we think is happening next. And we can see something very similar when it comes to Christian apocalyptic movements that are rooted in the Book of Revelation. The Book of Revelation is full of numbers and weird animals and bizarre scenes of all kinds and bowls of wrath and so forth. And these are, they're generatively incomprehensible. Nobody knows what they mean. And so they're open to being decrypted into different understandings of what's happening in the world. It's like this encrypted map, or this encoded map, that the followers decode in order to suddenly see, the world as it is. And so there's a lot to compare there, I think, with the way the Book of Revelation gets interpreted. And then I guess the last thing I would want to say is just speak to, and Allan's already getting at this, and I hope we talk more about it, the adaptability of this movement, the resiliency, the potential resiliency of it. We were hearing on January 21st, the day after the inauguration, many believed that on the inauguration day there was actually that the National Guard was just going to sort of rise up, and they were going to round up all of these, liberals who were part of this, cabal and publicly execute them. They really truly believed that that was going to be something that was going to be televised. And after the 20th of January, when that didn't happen, a lot of observers of the movement thought that that was it, that it was going to sort of just fade away very quickly. But we're already seeing that that's not true, that it's reinventing itself or reinterpreting its own scripture, if you will, its own drops and so forth. And even whether Q needs to be the center of it or not is becoming a question as well. So just that adaptability and that resilience that's there. And the other thing, just back to I am human, therefore nothing human is foreign to me. We have to ask ourselves why something like this is so powerful for people, why it's so compelling for people. And I think, one, it makes one feel like makes you feel like your life matters, that you're in the center of history, you're in the center of meaning and purpose. This is where we've been, this is where we are, and this is what's coming next, and we know it and we see it. It's good versus evil. It's not just everyday conflicts, but it's ultimate in that way. It gives adherents an insider identity. We're on the inside and we get it. And along with that, I think it gives people a sense of belonging. There's a lot of interesting research on why people convert to all kinds of different religious movements. And oftentimes, one of the patterns that you see that sociologists have identified is that there's a crisis in their personal life of some kind, a kind of breakdown or a change. Maybe they've moved, or maybe they've gone through a breakup or had a diagnosis or something like this that's created a kind of crisis. They connect with people, and that's the initial conversion, really, before they become full-on adherents of the movement. And then once they're connected, maybe they participate in an event or a protest or a study or something like that. And that's when they become involved in a more ideological way. But that sense of belonging, that sense of being part of a community is so powerful. And it's interesting to think about what that looks like and how that's working in our COVID world, where we're isolated from one another, and how this might be creating community and connection for people and be symptomatic in some ways of our COVID environment, the way it's sort of taken off. So I'll stop there, but Allan, what do you think?
Well, as you're so many different directions, of course, to sort of go in, but taking especially what you were just saying about the ways in which this sort of sets up a conversionary possibility, and I especially appreciate your point about how easy it would be for any of us to become this, and that we might sort of lose that. One thing actually I've been sort of have appreciated the opportunity to do in the time since the inauguration is actually to realize I had always, the evangelical fundamentalist Christian sort of side of this sort of immediately found place in my own thinking, like of course that fits in all these obvious ways. Interestingly, some of the other things I've been looking at has actually keyed me into more on the progressive side, or things I think of as part of more kind of liberal or to even use like hippie, I guess, kind of things that I never thought about as being sort of part of a similar motif, but are actually, if you're familiar with the ram's horn idea about ideology, I don't actually know how this might be total nonsense, but I heard this, and it has always stuck with me, as the idea that ideology is actually not linear. It's like a ram's horn, and actually that you can be far apart from each other, but weirdly, if you get to a very extreme place, you actually kind of come out weirdly closer together to each other. And so some of the people talking about this conspiratorial culture have actually pointed to, and this is like something I don't want to raise this in a too casual way with the crowd, because some of these things might be things that butt into our worlds a little bit, but some things, especially in like natural health and wellness circles, yoga practices, things like that are wrapped up in a similar kind of mentality of creating almost like cultures of knowing. So for example, and this is not something I was very aware of, but in the world of essential oils, there's like almost like an entire like alchemy that exists out there that is something you I hear about it and my immediate thought is religion. Like I'm like, oh, that sounds exactly like what I would think of from like ancient Greek magic and stuff like that. But it really has its own logic, and there are whole Facebook groups that are dedicated to this and all those other kinds of things. And it's interesting to think about that all of the different ways in which these things are related to parts of our lives that we wouldn't think of as traditionally part of religion, and yet interestingly in past contexts would be obviously part of a kind of religious instinct. This is something I've always kind of wanted to tease out for my own understanding, and it's always been a hard thing to really grasp hold of, is you have and I say this as religionists talking to a group of religionists, there's this question of sort of like, we have religion as this category, and it's usually helpful in an ancient context because there are these definitive things that we are so weird or so unusual to us. Sacrificing an animal and rubbing the blood all over your body is like not a thing we do. And so when ancient people do that, we're like, oh, that's religion. Like that's clearly it. And where that exists in our world is always a question, like sort of how it manifests itself, and always talking to students is usually the question of like, how do I describe how all-encompassing religion was? And I realize now that there are elements of this, just as you described, where our own needs, our own sense of wanting the world to make a certain kind of sense is part of this. And it struck me because the New York Times has done some really interesting follow-up, because they had done some sort of predecessor reporting, and now they've sort of followed up, and they had done some interviews with a woman who was sort of a QAnon guru on Facebook. Some of that material came out before the inauguration, and it was all about her expectations and how certain she was that things were going to happen a certain way. And then they followed up with her. And interestingly, her response to the very obvious and kind of valid question of what do you make of the fact that everything you thought was going to happen didn't happen, her immediate response was to personalize and emotionalize her own experience. And her response was all about how she had broken with family members. That's talking about a classic conversion narrative story. Somebody decides to convert to a different religious tradition. They lose touch with their family members, or their family members disassociate with them. And she said that the last fight she had with her sister said that she couldn't believe that she had fallen into this, and how unacceptable it was. And the woman's response was all about how her feelings were how condescending her sister had been. And that she didn't take seriously the fact that this woman now felt better about herself than she had ever felt, because QAnon had given her this sense of centering. And I raise all of this to say there's a lot of conversations, again, going on about sort of knowledge versus belief in our kind of economy of conspiracy and like what's verifiable. And you have, this idea of obviously the sort of truthiness of Trump's entire kind of modality and everything like that. But thinking about that kind of personal, it's almost like a piety as a driving force in this. So I don't have any conclusions about that, but just sort of raise that as another discussion point, what it sort of means to live in a world where people are being guided not only by their sort of rational processes, but also at times kind of feeling out their needs and finding things that are perhaps in some cases neutral or not necessarily harmful, and in some cases entails that you believe in a vast global conspiracy. So yeah, I don't have a conclusion about that, but I think it's an interesting dynamic.
For sure. And that's really interesting. I hadn't gone and seen that follow-up with her. I think the morning we spoke last time was the initial article
Indeed.
about her. Yeah, we might be neglecting the sort of personal, pietistic, emotional dimensions of experience for some in this. The thing I was thinking about when you said that she's sort of looking back and rethinking, reasons for this. In any, we have a word in religious studies. It's really more of a Christian word, but theodicy, which is a term that has to do in Christian tradition and in theistic traditions with trying to justify God in relation to some particular crisis. And so you can think of the why do bad things happen to good people as a theodicy problem within Christianity. But this crisis, if you want to call it that, of the inauguration day not panning out as expected and Trump not returning as expected, could be a kind of crisis that generates this kind of theodicy kind of thinking. Well, what did we miss? How do we explain this? How can we justify what happened over against what we expected to happen? You can think of in biblical history, the crisis of the destruction of the Second Temple, or in 70 Common Era for early Judaism, well, proto-Judaism really, right, Allan? As that kind of a crisis, and out of that crisis, there was generated, new religious movements of rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. The destruction of the temple and the exile of the Judean people by the Babylonians was a similar crisis. And so, in some ways, sometimes theodicy is a very personal process too, and that's what I heard you talking about with that person. I'm forgetting her name just now, but searching her heart and asking, what is going on there. And I love thinking about the dimensions of piety, as you put it, in relation to this as well.
Valerie Gilbert is her name, by the way.
Valerie Gilbert.
Only because you raised the Second Temple and that entire experience. That has actually also been the paradigm that I kind of always have in mind, and especially in this context, especially relevant because it's so formative for early Christianity. And so another interesting direction that I have wondered if it is helpful, at least it's been part of how I've processed this, and I think I brought this up in our last conversation, some of the Q groups, especially sort of leading up to, this was like back in December and November, I think I'd mentioned that apparently a monograph length study came out by some Q supporter about sort of Jesus, the messianic secret motif within early Christianity, and the idea that Q is this transhistorical phenomenon. And I thought how interesting that because this would have come out even before Trump lost the election, or at least it would have been worked on, that's so early in the process, because part of that study entailed the supporter basically making room for the idea that Trump was not actually the savior of this motif, but sort of saving the Q concept for belief, even if Trump sort of failed. And so I raised this to say, this is actually now going in the opposite direction. Instead of using the ancient world to make sense of QAnon, using QAnon to look backwards. That idea of the 70 CE moment when the temple is destroyed is like extremely, it's like one of our only firm dates. Like we date gospels with that moment in mind. And weirdly, this experience has made me wonder whether or not we didn't make a terrible assumption that people wouldn't either expect a disappointed end of like the temple's destruction or something, and have made room for it with many years like before it actually happened. Because apparently, at least there's an instinct when your belief is so sort of totalizing to do this. I always think of and a very formative way for me to think about this sort of religious impulse is Wayne Meeks, the New Testament scholar, has a book called Christ is the Question. And he sort of imagines the early Christian community after the crucifixion of Jesus. And this is sort of a broad way of thinking about that, but sort of with the crucifixion of Jesus in mind and the lack of an apocalyptic conclusion where God comes through the clouds and all of those other kinds of things. And he suggests that early Christians had two ways forward. They could despair or they could interpret. That they sort of, this was either the end point or they had to come up with some other way of thinking about the events that had happened that accorded them a way forward. And So thinking about that is sort of like, does this change our way of understanding that early Christian context? And then sort of from that question, what does this sort of suggest about, I've always thought of that as a strength of religious thinking, but of course in this case, where we're dealing with something that is wrapped up in extremely poisonous ideologies, it seems almost as a way of like reinscribing some of that hatefulness into the kind of ideological process where like now you have to double down on things. Maybe at first you were, sort of some of this stuff was at least more abstract or more uncertain to you, but now that Trump has been defeated, you have to like really get serious because the pedophiles have won, as it were, and you have to kind of double down.
Yeah. Almost as though the crisis makes the movement, and the birth of it is in that crisis, sort of in the same way that the birth of, you could argue anyway, that the birth of rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity was the destruction of the temple, and then the subsequent sacking of Jerusalem maybe as well. But yeah, I love that phrase, to despair or to interpret.
Yeah.
I wonder go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the idea of that as a generating point, because this really does attach to these conversations about our kind of I don't know what we want to, our discourse, I guess, our way of talking about things and verifying them, because we become so anxious about it, and it's become such a thing that we talk about in concrete terms. In fact, I revisited, if we all remember, Stephen Colbert back in, oh goodness, what even was it, 2000 and whatever it was, when he introduced truthiness as a concept. And I realized that's now like 15 years old, that's we've been wrestling with this idea. And so in a weird way, and I had a friend sort of talking about this, it kind of brings to the fore the way in which this is sort of like work that we're always going to be doing as a society. QAnon is sort of like a lightning place where it's happening, but in reality it's happening sort of all around us, and that we then need to become even better and more thoughtful. Well, religionists would be a good example, but also philosophers and literary critics and all the people that we need to have in order to sort of suss out all the ways in which our thinking is going in the direction that it's going. It turns out we haven't given up our archaic religious selves. We've just transformed them.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I think part of our challenge is to continue to press to talk across those different boundaries between different religious ideologies, and I guess try to stake our faith in some kind of conversation that can cross over those, so that they're not just completely incommensurable to one another. Someone was asking in the chat about QAnon relative to Christianity and apocalyptic Christianity, which I alluded to just briefly at the beginning, and then also how is this any different from ISIS or a movement like that? And what all three of them have in common is this apocalypticism, and many have argued that religion, when it crosses that line into militancy and justifying terrorism and violence, that a piece of what makes that possible is almost always something we could call apocalypticism, that which sees the world in terms of good versus evil, turns ordinary opponents into the devil and his minions, and therefore justifies violence against them. Clover and I were talking about this the other night, and I think that the other piece that could be a factor here is when you get to a point where you think it's not possible to affect change within the institutions that are already established, that are in place, when you come to decide that those are, corrupt or dysfunctional to the point that it requires violence in order to bring about the change in the world, that our vision has for it, which might be world peace. I mean, actually, QAnons talk a lot about world peace and the end of war and the end of violence that's going to come after the cabal falls. But you think about even like a movement such as Earth First or some other sorts of radical movements on the left who have decided, or the Revolutionary Communist Party, who have decided. And I'm not saying they're wrong or right, really. I'm speaking more descriptively. They've decided that you're not going to affect real change within the system. It's going to require a revolution, and there's going to be violence. And there already is violence, some would even say. And so that justifies violence as well. I think that's another dimension of what we have to be thinking about.
So, and because you raised that, and this is, of course, an unresolvable part of our conversation as a society, because we're constantly getting caught up on it. Of course, is the idea of how we create epistemic authority and how we affirm norms, and so some of those kinds of questions. And I always think of there's this great moment in if you ever remember the old movie Man for All Seasons, Thomas More and Henry VIII and all that kind of stuff. And there's this moment where Thomas More's son-in-law is talking about how much he hates the Lutherans and how he's desperate to go find Martin Luther, and he's talking about how he would even go and he basically was talking about like an extrajudicial kind of capturing of Martin Luther and wanting to tear down these laws that stop him from being able to do this. And Thomas More has this great theatrical moment where he grabs him and he says, the moment you start doing that, you start tearing down our norms, you start tearing down our laws, because it's the devil and you have to go get the devil is so dangerous that it's nothing is more important. He said finally you'll grab the devil by the collar and the devil will turn around and you have nothing to protect you because you've torn down all of the normative and sort of social things that are in place.
Mm-hmm.
Raising all that example to say, I think an interesting question for the I'll even use the word theological work to be done at this stage, it strikes me, is navigating the we've sectarianized ourselves in so many ways where we're getting information and how we're processing what's out there is so completely unique and sort of sui generis in their own contexts. You brought up anti-Semitism as an example of one of the things that's sort of at the root of what's going on here. And I think that's so important, not least because with Marjorie Taylor Greene, is it Marjorie Taylor Greene?
I think so.
Marjorie Greene, the QAnon congresswoman, and her, I'm sure we all saw the Jewish laser that's causing the California wildfires. That was always it's like I knew the Jewish thing was going to come up here in some bizarre form or another. The laser coming down to create the fires, and to realize how much that sort of patterns the anti-Semitism is sort of a pattern of how we other people and how we create those kinds of distinctions and differences. And all I can say is that it strikes me that with QAnon's ascendant rise, and with not only the fact that it could rise, but also how it could rise and among whom it could rise, that whatever the way forward is for us is not that I don't think we have a pattern for it. This isn't a question of rebuilding something that we had gotten in some very clear way, but there's going to have to be some other process of developing a way of knowing and a way of interacting in the world that is more generous or more gracious with one another, while also being somehow more defensive about the ability for these things to thrive the way that they have. That's just my take.
Yeah, what I hear in that, I mean, what I take away from that theologically is the necessity, the urgency, which has been with us a long time, within the Christian communities, to be incredibly self-critical and self-reflective about the ways in which, especially that white supremacy And, at the core of that, anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, racism shape us and our theology, and the weird, really disturbing anxieties that go right back to the beginning of Christianity and trying to differentiate itself from Judaism, and in trying to somehow supersede Judaism's claim on, divine promise and chosenness and all of that. And I mean, that's theological stuff, but it's deeply anxious, and those kinds of anxieties and denials are the root of so much violence in the world. And that's one place where we as Christians can really try to be more honest about that. Clover, hey.
Hey, thank you all. This is so rich. I'm writing down many questions myself. I think you all are right here where I want to ask a question. You've led yourselves there. It's really important to be, and I'm so grateful for religionists who watch these belief systems and are sympathetic in that you are trying to understand, and you help us do that as normal people out on the streets. But some of us, have aunts and uncles, brothers, fathers who, particularly during this time of pandemic, is what I understand, have really gotten into this because they're in front of computer screens so much, or maybe some of you out there are. But they've gone down these rabbit holes and they've become isolated in their systems. And that's what I've read and understand. But here we are, the normal family person, trying to build a bridge, trying to have a sense. So trying to be, hopefully, not condescending, as you mentioned, not condescending to our friends and families, but not letting them off the hook, that there's accountability in this extremism. How do we balance that, trying to not judge or criticize and have sympathy of where someone could end up, why someone could end up in this place, and understanding where's the danger when these poisonous ideologies. There is danger here, and I'm just trying to figure out when do I call it out, and when am I not so judgmental, because there are elements in my own belief systems that can go over the edge as well. Essential oils. I didn't know that. That's a whole thing. Well, the anti-vaxxers, they've gravitated to QAnon, I understand, because there's these rigid systems that somehow speak in the same way. Anyway, what would you say to us about navigating the real world and real people? Does that make sense?
Yes. When you said, what are the dangers, I thought I went in two different directions. One is, I think last night when we were talking, you said, when does something like this become dangerous? And I think on that sort of level, whenever a movement becomes an othering machine, turns others into monsters who against whom any kind of violence is justified, it's dangerous. As soon as it others in that way, violence is possible. So that's one answer. But related to that, I think the danger is isolation for someone, being isolated from others. And so because the more you're in dialogue, this is kind of what you were talking about, Allan, the more you're in dialogue and in conversation, the more impossible it becomes to other someone else, to see someone else as other. You begin to see yourself in the other and the other in yourself, right? Both sides of the dialogue do. And so I think isolation is the danger. And the last thing one would want to do with someone who's really, immersed in this would be to bombard them with all of the Q drops that have not come true or that have been contradicted or whatever, to try to debunk it. I don't think that's effective. That's what probably anyone would expect you to try to do. I feel like asking honest questions and trying to see yourself and your own religious inclinations in that person who is into this, to break down the kind of self, other, us, them dynamic, so that there's a relationship there. And then maybe if a crisis comes along later for someone like that, then you're available and you're not going to judge and you're not going to say, I told you so. I think about, gosh, it's really easy to analogize to other kinds of conversations that we've all had with our family members and friends around things that we disagree strongly with, about, such as, for example, questions around sexual identity and sexual orientation. And, if you turn it into an oppositional battle, maybe someday you'll get to say, see, I told you so, I was right and you're wrong, and look, you've changed your mind, and then they feel defensive, versus opening up a dialogue and maintaining that. What do you think, Allan?
I care so much about this question. Like, to me, this is the centerpiece. This and it has to be
question.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the time. I hope it's okay. Over.
Yes. No. Please. Yes. Write that.
Oh my gosh. And I say this in terms of caring about and the importance of the question, because to me there's some very, very realistic thing. And you talk about the idea of the violence that this sort of QAnon as an example, but any of these abrasive alternative ideologies are, and how willing they are. ISIS is an example. Certainly a group that has promulgated violence across the world. And then thinking about it as again, that us versus them that the circumstance throws us into, though I do think we can evolve past that us versus them, but we're in it right now, or that's the paradigm that is in front of us. And then you realize that if you are in an us versus them economy, like, I don't know about anyone else in this particular group, but I am not prepared to genocide the whole other part of this, and that is the only conceptual way forward. If I don't do the talk about despair or interpret, if I don't do the interpretive work to realize that the other in this case is still a human, is still a person, not to tout my own community that I find myself serving, but I'm serving Unitarian Universalist Church. I'm not Unitarian Universalist in my background. We're doing a lot of work trying to figure out ways to talk about what they have to offer to the world. And for me, one of the things they have to offer is universalism. I mean, universalism is a extremely audacious claim to make. I'm like, are you kidding? Everyone gets in the boat, like every single individual. Right. That is so
what grace? Crazy. What? Yeah.
I mean, and there's just a huge, like, Hitler is there, and like you welcome that version of people in. But to say all of that, to say that it does then, I think for progressives, it does push against our instinct to not to call them to account. I think that is absolutely crucial. And we can call them to account by never wavering in our own values. But at the same time, that we never look at a person and don't see their own instinct to hatred and violence as anything other than the manifestation of their fear, as anything other than the messing up of their own humanity, and to always to realize that seeing them as a human is actually the radical act. And that is really the thing that is hard for us to do, because it's so easy to want to say, Donald Trump, you are a disaster and you are blah, blah, blah. It's so easy to do that. So I say that, and only because it happens to be Super Bowl Sunday, I will throw this out there, which I think I referenced maybe in our last chat, is to say, I was somebody growing up who was bookish enough and nerdy enough to have always sort of hated professional sports. And I always thought of this as this jockey, dumb thing. And why did people care about this? And I realize now, as a grown-up, and also having moved to Cleveland, a city with a famously
That's right. You got to be careful.
Yeah, exactly. But I've learned that it turns out there is a real utility to having high stakes on meaningless events that actually people need to devoted to their team and to their sport and to their whatever is a fantastic way to meet someone at a human level, where the stakes are not whether or not the person I voted for drinks the blood infants or whatever it happens to be, and there actually is sort of like a plus side to the idea of seeing that kind of humanity through. And sports is one example. You can come up with a billion others, but the willingness to still go fishing with, travel to a museum with, go to a sporting event, whatever happens to be.
Right.
Anyway, sorry. This to me, this is like,
this is the thing. Yeah.
Amen.
No, I'm grateful.
Thank
I
you.
heard one woman, and then we can end. We're at 11:01. Had a sociologist from University of Delaware, I believe, who speaks about conspiracy and how family members get into these situations, and how we can connect with them. And one of the things that she said that goes along with what you all are saying is that because it becomes a self-sealing system, and that isolationism, that she said that the loved one or the friend becomes so distanced from their real life that they enter into a whole world that is a different world than their life and their history. And she recommended that if you have a loved one in it, say your sister is in this, to remind her to stop talking about the system. You're not going to talk them out of it. They think it's logical. So you think it's illogical. They think it's logical. But you can remind them of your human connection as sisters. So, hey, I was just thinking about you, and remember when we went to the lake when we were little and you fell in and it was, funny, or remember when Mom, and she said, just to remember that, remind them of who they are as in a different system, and for you to remember that they are in a different relationship with you, that we haven't all been reduced to these belief systems and even politics. I mean, I think it just doesn't have to apply to conspiracy theories, but our political worlds, to remember our human connection in that way. So
I love that. Or if you're a Cleveland sports fan, hey, remember the shot, remember the fumble.
No, yeah, precisely that. And maybe those are places also to practice.
Yes.
For some of those other places, you can just have a little bit of low stakes,
yes,
either argument or
like
confrontation or whatever it is, and it doesn't matter that much.
Yeah.
But that idea of reminding each other's humanity, that to realize that the way forward, with the other side being willing to throw so many out of the boat, to realize that the only way forward is we actually have to collect everybody. At least centers the sense of mission or the sense of calling to be one where no way forward can be one that dismisses or throws out the people who, for so many of us, are close.
That's right. And for people who claim to follow a faith tradition that love wins and that grace abounds and mercy and justice are central. It is a high calling to not dismiss.
And we ended up
these folks.
Right.
Exactly. Right.
Our own little apocalyptic. Yeah.
Our own little apocalyptic. Well, I'm so grateful to both of you. I know that our participants are really grateful. Someone asked if we would be recording this. We are recording this. Are you all, both of you, okay with us posting this to, for folks to be able to access this? Some people are saying, I would love, other people to hear this, friends, family to hear this. I'm just going to put you on the spot. Are you cool with that? This, yeah.
Yeah, no problem at all.
Allan says yes.
And
I'm so glad that this is a possibility.
Signing the writer right on live on the Zoom itself.
Well, QAnon's a little tricky. I don't want anyone to feel a little at risk by putting yourself out there. But as of right now, I think we will have it posted, and to have people be able to access it and share it. If that changes, we'll let you know. All right. Thank you all. Thank you both so much. Thank you all for being here, Allan. We are delighted to have you in this Zoom
Thanks,
world that
Allan.
we can
Real pleasure. Yeah.
yeah pipe in.
What wouldn't have been possible in any other context, weirdly.
No,
So
exactly. So this is a silver lining. All right. God bless you. Peace to all of you, and have a great day.